Well, there have been a lot of misreadings of Adam Smith, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century. And he's often read as being a libertarian, sort of laissez-faire capitalist, where anything goes as long as you pursue your own self-interest. But actually, Adam Smith didn't say that. Rather, what he said is, in the marketplace, of course we pursue our self-interests, and that's just fine, and that's normal and natural. However, if we become greedy, and he used the word avaricious, a word we don't use anymore, but I think it's very descriptive, that the markets don't work. They won't work well. We'll create monopolies. We will lie and cheat and steal other people for our own ends. And then he argues the markets will fail. And in fact, he says markets will only succeed under principles of justice. If you want a really well-working free market system, you must operate under principles of justice that are not only governmentally enforced, but are individual as well. I can think of at least two examples. In the 19th century, when Adam Smith was read as being this sort of amoral, sort of cowboy capitalist, we saw the rise, of course, of the corporation. We saw the rise of sweatshops. We saw the rise of the turning away of workers and treating them badly. We saw, of course, enormous greed. The early Rockefeller factories, for example, which were bad, and Rockefeller, as you know himself, finally reformed. It's as if he went back and read Adam Smith and realized that what he had done early on in his career was bad. And he actually sort of had this charismatic change of mind. But we see later, particularly in the 20th century and now in the 21st century, for example, corporations who take so seriously not only their social responsibility, but their environmental responsibility. They're beginning to see themselves as finding ways to make plenty of money, but as being conscious of the environment and of people around them. Adam Smith would have been very, very pleased with those organizations. So we see examples on both sides, I would say. Well, John Locke, as you recall, was sort of the father of the idea of human rights. Not only that humans have the right to life and to liberty, but also they have a right to private property. And now in the 17th century, that was very important. Then in the 19th century, we see that being enacted with the founding of the modern corporation and the idea of property rights as part of what companies do, and the right to free enterprise and obviously profitability. Where that becomes irresponsible is when companies forget that their rights are limited by the rights of other people and of other companies. So if we become exploiters of, say, if we have a sweatshop and don't pay people enough wages, if we pollute the environment, all sorts of things that we see a few companies doing, particularly offshore, those companies have forgotten about the very basis for our capitalist free enterprise system, which is the idea of rights, but the idea of equal rights, so that everyone has equal rights, no more rights than anybody else. So those are sort of the lessons we learn from Locke. And frankly, we have to keep going back and rereading Locke to remind us sometimes of those lessons when we get, shall we say, a little excited and carried away and forget about what companies are doing to other people and, of course, to the environment. Well, for those of you who haven't yet read our book, you'll be surprised, after looking at the title, that we do have a section on Marx. Now, the reason we have that section is, although Marx's ideas of turning us into an anarchical communist society have never taken place and probably never will, his idea on rights of workers to feel good about themselves, to identify with their work, those ideas were instrumental in the late 19th century in, for example, laws against child labor, working laws that prevented people from working 6 and 7 days a week, 14 to 16 hours a day in miserable conditions. And also his worry about markets. In the in the crisis of 2001 and again 2008, people have gone back and read Marx again, because he said, you know, if you create markets and leverage money, leverage money, leverage money, and if you think that money is an end in itself, you will create the very economic crises that we've had. For him, money at best is a means for growth, a means for good salaries, a means for economic growth, obviously, and value added. But if money becomes an end, then we see the subprime mortgage crisis and earlier bad behaviors by companies, our famous companies like Enron and Tyco and Arthur Andersen and all of those. So we've learned a lot from Marx. He's been enormously influential in helping us criticize ourselves and in making capitalism a lot better than it was in the 19th century when he was writing about it. Herbert Spencer, as many of you know, was called a social Darwinist. He believed in social evolution, which paralleled Darwin's theory of natural evolution. So he thought human beings will evolve from simple to very complex human beings. But, says Spencer, we should all be left alone to do that by ourselves with very little interference. And in fact, he was worried even about vaccines because it interfered with our immune systems. He thought, of course, that those of us who are physically strong, that we should be able to withstand smallpox, and those of us who weren't, well, perhaps we should leave the gene pool, so to speak. So he was a very strong libertarian. However, and so you see that particularly in 19th century examples of the great robber barons in our society. On the other hand, Spencer had the idea that corporations should be democratic organizations run by the managers and workers themselves. Now, we have never gone that far, but it's interesting to see that that was his idea because he thought he had so much trust in individuals and individual competency that he thought we as a group could run a company much better than having a president, vice president, and the hierarchy that we see in many companies. If you look at Silicon Valley, many of the high-tech companies are run in this very level with very little hierarchy. That actually is Herbert Spencer's idea. And as you know, many of them are extraordinarily successful. He would be very pleased with that. If we go back to the 19th century, we'll discover that the modern corporation as we know it didn't exist. Rather, companies were formed as joint stock companies. They were government mandated. They had limited life, rather than state mandated. They had limited life, unlike the unlimited life of state chartered corporations today. And part of their mandate was to do something for the public good in addition to whatever they were doing, which was usually a for-profit venture. When the modern corporations were formed with state charters, obviously to try to avoid the government mandates, and given unlimited life, the idea, the mandate that they must do something for the public good was dropped from their charter. And that we saw then really an enormous rise of non-government organizations taking up that cause for various forms of the public good. So today we have a plethora of non-government organizations, not only in the United States, but globally, all over the world, worrying about sweatshops, worrying about workers, worrying about the environment, worrying about corporate responsibility to their even to their shareholders with shareholder initiatives, worrying about customer rights. Our whole consumer movement was started by non-government organizations, worrying about safety. And all of these, some of these now have been formed into, as you know, government agencies. But all of those started as non-government organizations formed by private individuals or groups of individuals to try to balance corporate misdeeds. It doesn't mean that all corporations do bad things. It means that we need a balance to get us thinking about some new views. And they've been enormously helpful. Now, some of them just make up things and have blogs and lie. We all know that. But, of course, some individuals do that, too. But by and large, non-government organizations give us a balance not only between corporations and the public, but also between government, because many of them, of course, are critical of government as well. So I hope for a long life for non-government organizations as forming this great triangle between government, corporations, and this third public arm, if you like, of a public voice, which is the NGO. Well, I probably have 2 or 3 takeaways, or a lot of takeaways. But one is that the history itself is very complex. And we tried to make it as complex as we could in this book. But of course, there was even more to be written. We had a finite length of time and wanted to finish the book before we all, of course, retired or went someplace else. But what I have learned is how important it is to go back and read again the histories. We can learn so much. We can learn positive things, and we can learn about our mistakes that we shouldn't have made and can easily not make again. So they're great lessons learned. And to go back to the great thinkers of Locke and Smith and Spencer and Marx and Weber and de Tocqueville, for example, we can learn so much today about how we can be more responsible as companies and how it can really be beneficial and create a great deal of value added, not just for shareholders, but for other stakeholders and certainly for communities as well. Well, my first takeaway is it's very difficult to work with 4 other people because each of us has a different view of how to do this project. On the other hand, that was extraordinarily rewarding because as we debated each chapter down to the last detail. We all read each other's work. I learned so much from my colleagues in this process. I hope they learned a little bit from me as well. So it is a difficult process, it's a long process, and it's extraordinarily rewarding, and I think our book is a result.